All right, we're live. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whenever or wherever you are. Mr. David Swanson, Bacon County High School. I'm glad you have found this video. If you're in my classroom, Club 1206, you're probably watching this because either I'm gone or you've been gone and you're catching up on our class content. If you're from the dark recesses of the internet, welcome. We're glad you're here. This is going to be day one, part one of the Age of Jackson. Of course, we're referring to Andrew Jackson, our seventh president. This is one of the only periods of U.S. history named after a single specific person. I mean, we have the Great Depression, we have the World at War eras. Those aren't named after a person. This is the Age of Jackson because how much Andrew Jackson dominated it. So let's briefly remember. After the era of good feelings, James Monroe, we've got the rising edge towards sectionalism. And here we find ourselves in the Age of Jackson. So let's meet the man and find out some things that he did. If you're in my class, you're filling in fill in the blank notes, follow along notes, and of course you have the Andrew Jackson baseball card. So remember all that important vocabulary. Here is Andrew Jackson, the Major General. He actually was a Revolutionary War veteran. And by that, I'm going to show you this picture here. He's about as young as possible to be a Revolutionary War veteran. He was a youth at the time of the war. Actually, he was age 13 when he was a courier for the Continental Army. He carried messages. And at one point, he was actually even captured by the British. And the picture we see here depicts a British officer. Okay, that's not Jackson with the sword. Jackson is the young man with his hand up. The British officer actually ordered the young man, hey, boy, shine my boots. And Andrew Jackson, bold, brave, brash, maybe even rude, as a young man, refused. The officer slashed at him, actually cut him on his hand, and he carried a scar with him for the rest of his life. So a young veteran. He was imprisoned. He was captured there. He was also imprisoned on a warship, contracted smallpox. His brother died of smallpox. His mother got them released, but she died shortly thereafter. And actually, at the end of the war, he finds himself orphaned. So a veteran of war, he saw his country go through a lot, and orphaned by age 13. That's also an important part of his background. We got to understand the man to understand his policies or understand his behavior as president. And being a young veteran and an orphan by age 14, Andrew Jackson is a different kind of man than the presidents we've talked about so far. He's going to be a common man. He's going to represent the commoners as opposed to our first 6 presidents that we've spoken of who were more from the ruling elite from wealth. So Andrew Jackson, he's the dawning of a different age. That's why it's called the Age of Jackson. Another thing about him, he's nicknamed Old Hickory for his toughness, and that toughness started in his youth, as I just shared. He was also a veteran of the Indian Wars and also known for dueling. By dueling, I mean whenever someone insulted you or offended you, you could challenge them to a duel. And Andrew Jackson was rumored to have been in up to 100 duels. However, not all of them came to shots fired. Sometimes you would threaten to go to the dueling grounds, but not actually get to the point of standing 10 paces apart and shooting. But Andrew Jackson did kill a man in one of his duels. He also received a shot. He was shot in the rib cage area, and actually that bullet was lodged into his ribs for the rest of his life. It was never removed. So he was tough in that regard. And the nickname Old Hickory is a type of wood, a type of tree, and it is known for being very tough. A lot of walking sticks are made of hickory. A lot of furniture is made of hickory. So being nicknamed Old Hickory, it's a tough wood, and he's a tough man. And his whole background just speaks to that, from his youth to his duels to his military background. He was definitely a tough man. He rose to the rank of Major General. That is a 2-star general during the War of 1812. And we previously met with Andrew Jackson as he was winning the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, a battle that didn't necessarily need to be fought, but it was still very decisive in securing the victory, the War of 1812. It kind of let our nation finish on a high point. We really beat the Brits, even though the treaty had already been negotiated. Andrew Jackson did the most for him. It propelled him to fame. And when you're famous in America, you can do whatever you want. And when you have name recognition, you run for politics or you run for office. That's exactly what he did. He got famous at the Battle of New Orleans, and he runs for office on his name. on his fame. So there he is, picture we've already looked at the Battle of New Orleans. And another of note, he was also an Indian fighter. He was involved in Indian wars, and he leads a campaign against the Seminole and Creek Indians. He goes into Florida, chasing the Seminoles at one point. Actually, little known fact, Jacksonville, Florida is named for Andrew Jackson. So I bet a lot of us have visited Jacksonville, Florida from where we live in Georgia. Jacksonville, Florida, named for Andrew Jackson because of his activities in and around the area during the Indian Wars. And a battle in particular, this is a little outside of our GSE standards, but I want to tell you about it because it's close to us. He wins a battle at a place known as Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. I've actually visited this place. I visited when I was in the military, active duty, and we went and toured the battlefield, and we kind of looked at different fighting positions. How would I have done it? Here's where the enemy was. Here's where the American soldiers were. And you can see it's named for a reason. It looks like a horseshoe bend. The Indians were actually inside this alcove right here with their backs to the water. Now, they had canoes situated, already pre-staged all along the water, and they had a fence line right here, about where I'm pointing with my pointer right there. And the Americans, I'll show you this picture right here. The Americans, their first obstacle was to get over the fence line. And it was kind of it was an abattis is the right word for it. And it's cross sections, almost shaped like triangles. You can see there, pointy sticks facing upward and outward. So it was a defendable position for the Indians, but the Americans had to send wave after wave after wave to get over the fence line. However, once they did get over the fence line, they were quickly able to get to the enemy, the Indian encampments, and the Indians had to escape on their canoes. So I walked that battlefield. It's in Alabama. It's set up like a museum. It's something you could go and visit today, should you choose to. I'm always encouraging you to interact with history. Let's pick up with Andrew Jackson in his first run for president. Yes, I said first. So the election of 1824 is going to pit Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is the son of our second president, John Adams. John Quincy Adams is very often called the first son because he was the first son of the founding generation to rise to age where he could run for president himself. It's almost like we said James Monroe was the last of the tricorn hats, the last of the founding fathers, and now they're passing off to their sons' generations. And Andrew Jackson is going to represent a different type of man entirely, a weapon, someone who doesn't come from wealth and means, being an orphan, being from a rugged background. So you have the first son and the frontiersman, the common man, in the election of 1824. The election of 1824 was known as a pretty vicious election. Let's find out why. So John Quincy Adams, here he is, the son of President John Adams. A lot of support in New England, the northern states. He comes from wealth. He's known as old money. He's the last edge of the founding fathers generation, being from the bloodline, right? I already said the first time. He represented the interests of the elites, the wealthy, the banking, those who would benefit from Henry Clay's American system initiatives, such as roads and canals, these internal improvements. So he definitely represented the wealth, and Andrew Jackson was on the opposite side of that, representing the commoner. So let's look at the election of 1824. This is an electoral map here. The Federalist Party has dissolved, and so essentially there is just one party running for office. It's four different Democratic Republicans. One party is really not good for politics because you actually don't have an opportunity to say, I'm on this side or I'm on that side. You know, you don't have conversation about the issues. And also, as it were, nobody received a majority of the Electoral College or even of the popular vote. So take a look there. You can see that nobody got 50% of either the electoral vote or the popular vote. And according to our Constitution, this would mean that the election goes to the House of Representatives to decide. And this takes it out of the hands of the people. Like, this is something that's kind of un-American. We want the people to decide who our president is. In this case, it's a tiebreaker situation. The election went to the House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams is named the next president. Now, it is not essentially, it's not really agreed upon by everybody that John Quincy Adams should be the next president. Actually, it took a lot of backroom deal making for John Quincy Adams to get the necessary votes. And it was Henry Clay who worked the deal for John Quincy Adams to become the next president. And the allegation, and there's a lot of evidence that goes both ways here, but the allegation is that John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay a promise like, hey, if you get the votes for me in Congress, I will make you the next Secretary of State. We do know that they had a conversation together. We'll never know exactly what they talked about, but the implication is that John Quincy Adams said, give me the votes, I'll give you a job, Secretary of State, very prestigious job. A lot of times the Secretary of State was seen as the next president in waiting, so it would have been very good for Henry Clay to have that job. Andrew Jackson never wanted to back down from a fight. He calls Adams' victory a corrupt bargain. So the election of 1824 becomes known as a corrupt bargain, and that's just not good for democracy. See the picture here. So John Quincy Adams, the president, hey, thanks for helping me win the election, and he's handing over the position of the Secretary of State. Not a good look for politics, not a good look for our leader, and it's going to kind of overshadow his whole term as president as well. He's our sixth president, John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson calls it a corrupt bargain, and as such, even in defeat, his reputation starts to rise. He is seen as a man of the people, and he spends the next 4 years campaigning for president, right? He spends the next 4 years getting ready for the election of 1828, and what he does is he works to revoke property qualifications from voting. A big reason that the election of 1824 went to John Quincy Adams is because at this time, 1824, in order to vote, you had to own property. That does not let everybody in the nation vote. That's not exactly what we stood for when we say all men created equal. And, we struggle with that word. All men created equal, but we still have slavery in the country. Well, all people should be allowed to vote. But what that really meant was landowning, rich, white males, not women and not minorities, and not even those who don't own property. Andrew Jackson works to remove the property qualification part of it. Even if you don't own land, you should still get to vote. He's a common man working for the common man. So let's see how that works out for him. Enter the election of 1828. Copy and paste, same cast, same characters. Andrew Jackson versus the now sitting president, John Quincy Adams. A lot of people call the election of 1828 the birth of modern politics. It's one of the first times it got pretty ugly. One of the first times that that the candidates were, the phrase slinging mud at each other. John Quincy Adams calls Andrew Jackson a barbarian who can barely spell his own name. So, you can see that it gets kind of nasty, the election of 1828. Well, what Andrew Jackson has done in those previous 4 years is work to create universal suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. It does not mean suffering. It's the right to vote. So universal white male suffrage, because unfortunately minorities can't still vote. Unfortunately, women can't still vote. But Andrew Jackson has worked to create the situation where all free white men can vote, regardless of your property ownership status. You don't have to own land. You don't have to be wealthy at this point. Makes the country more democratic, and it allows simpler men, you see the words on your screen there, allows simpler men like Andrew Jackson to vote. And who are they going to vote for? They're going to vote for someone like them. They're going to vote for someone who helped them get the right to vote. They're going to vote for Andrew Jackson. So now it allows someone who doesn't come from wealth to be able to contend for public office. It basically gives Andrew Jackson the chance to be the president. Let's look at these two maps now. So on the left-hand side, 1824, I want you to look at the total popular vote. 356,000 votes were cast in 1824. Now I want you to look at 1828, and I've circled it on the screen, 1,155,000 popular votes. 3 times as many people vote because of the universal suffrage, what Andrew Jackson worked for. Many of those voters vote for Andrew Jackson, and you can see the map. On the right-hand side, the difference is yellow and red. Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian Democrat, that's his party, is swept into office. The election of 1828 gives us our 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Now, I said his party, so, Democratic Republicans from the previous election, 4 of them were fighting for the presidency. Well, now we're back to parties, and Andrew Jackson is seen as the first modern Democrat. Democrats today, Democrats in power today would trace their lineage to Andrew Jackson. I'm going to tell you the story of the Democrat Party right now. I'll tell you the story of the Republican Party when we get to that. But right now, Jackson creates the Democrat Party, sometimes called Jacksonian Democrats. Today, of course, just called Democrats. And the picture on the screen right here is the logo for the Democrat Party today, and it's a donkey. And you may wonder why the Democrat Party is represented by a donkey. Here's the why. One of Jackson's opponents called him, he's insulting him. This is the era of mudslinging and calling your opponents bad names. He calls Jackson a jackass. And Jackson, instead of being offended by that, he takes on the statement and makes it work in his favor. He makes it into the logo of his party. So Jackson, the jackass, is the namesake of the logo of the Democrat Party. The reason the Democrat Party's logo is a donkey is because Andrew Jackson was called a jackass during the election of 1828. I've had students not remember much from this class, but they tell me at the end of the year, I'll tell you, Mr. Swanson, I remember why the Democrat Party's logo is a donkey. So you may not remember much from this class, but you're probably going to remember that factoid right there. So now we have President Jackson, the 7th president of the United States. He is going to be known for strengthening the power of the presidency. This is going to be called Jacksonian democracy. Anything that relates to the strengthening of the executive office is going to be referred to as Jacksonian democracy or helping the common man. And he's going to be known for taking on many opponents. I want you to think of him as a boxer. Okay, I got boxing gloves on the screen there. Jackson's a fighter. He's going to take on many opponents in his time in office, just like he was known for dueling and fighting as a military man. Now he's going to take on many opponents in office. A couple of fun facts about Jackson. So at his inauguration, as a man of the people, he invites commoners into the White House. And he throws a party, right? He throws a rager. He throws a multi-day rager of a party at the White House. And at the White House, he had a large block of cheese, a very sizable block of cheese. I don't even know how many pounds. Look at the picture there, a very sizable block of cheese. And people who came to the White House just sliced off a hunk of cheese and ate it right there. That was their party favor, right? That was the food they had at the party. And it is said that, as the cheese started crumbling, it was getting ground into the carpet, and the White House was in total disarray. Drink was being spilled. And as when the party finally dispersed days later, there was a mess in the White House, a stench that would stick around for a very long time. Quite frankly, some would say it never went away from this block of cheese and all the drink that was spilled during Jackson's party. Another example of Jackson being attempted assassinations on his life. So I'm just giving you examples of his toughness. One such example, a man who intended to assassinate him waited around behind a pillar. And as the president approached, and again, this is before Secret Service, this is before the security that you guys know is normal today. As the president approached, he pulled out one flintlock pistol, click, no bang, pistol malfunction. He pulled out another, click, no bang, 2 pistols in a row malfunctioned. And the statistical probability of that is astronomical. 1 in, pick a real big number, 1 in a billion. I had a gunsmith in my class one time who actually gave me the statistics on it. 1 in a very high number. It's improbable that 2 guns would malfunction back to back. They're just made to function, not to malfunction. So the president's life was spared in that moment. He wasn't shot. And he actually, to demonstrate his toughness, takes his walking cane and starts beating on his would-be assassin. So just another example of his toughness. He doesn't run away. He doesn't get behind the security guards. He beats on the assassin who is attempting to take his life. So definitely a tough man, takes on many opponents. Let's go ahead and see the first of them now. So what we're going to get to in this first day is Andrew Jackson versus the Native Americans. Not a high point of his legacy, a very sad point, actually. So let's jump into it now. Jackson is known for passing the Indian Removal Act. If you want to get really specific, it's the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The 5 civilized tribes were forced to relocate to the west onto reservations, Indian reservations, much smaller areas than their original territory, leaving their homes and being forced onto these smaller territories, reservations, leaving behind what they have always known, the heritage of their ancestors, the homes of their youth, the place that their children have been growing up, forced west onto reservations, and this is known as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was the route they took. So I'm going to elaborate on this whole Jackson versus the Native Americans and the Indian Removal Act over the next couple of slides. Jackson and the natives. So the Native Americans, the problem is that the natives were living on land that white settlers wanted in the Southeast, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Tennessee. And Jackson was trying to come up with a legal way to get them removed from these lands. Jackson believed that it was impossible for the whites and the natives to live together, and that the United States was expanding and that the good land belonged to the white man. And obviously you can see the racist overtones here. Jackson did not respect the land of those who were already on it. And this is the starting point of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. First of all, when we say the 5 civilized tribes, what we mean by that is that even that word civilized is, clouded in racist attitude. It's as if to say they have adopted the white man's attitudes and they're no longer savages, they're civilized. Characterized as assimilating into American culture in a variety of degrees, adopting the white man's ways, religion. Many of them converted to Christianity, having a constitutional government, a central government, a written constitution with the Supreme Court. They spoke English, right? So assimilating into the white man means that they speak English, intermarrying with whites, some of them even running plantations and owning slaves. So fitting into the white man's ways, this is what makes them civilized. Pretty easy way to remember them. This is extra, but CC, CC, and S. Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. These are the 5 civilized tribes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was one of Jackson's personal initiatives. He specifically encouraged Congress to pass this act. He didn't do that with many other things. He governed from afar. He strengthened the executive with executive orders, but he specifically got involved in Congress for the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Congress, you will pass this action. Put it on my desk and I will sign it. One of the only initiatives that he directed to Congress in his presidency. And what it did was it authorized the federal government to force the Native Americans of the Southeast off of their lands. And the reason why was because it was valuable farmland. The desire for this land increased even greater when gold was discovered on Cherokee lands in North Georgia. We live in Georgia, probably part of your Georgia studies, you're familiar with that concept. So the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the plan was to send them to the Great Plains. This land was seen as worthless. This land is present-day Oklahoma, and it was called by Congress as a barren, worthless desert. Hey, let's just send the Indians to, it was not called Oklahoma at the time, it's called the Indian Territory. Well, I have a unique perspective on all this. I teach in Georgia. I grew up in Oklahoma. I've seen the Indians in their territories thriving. Okay, they have made businesses, they have made homes in Oklahoma, but now I teach in Georgia, and I see the tragedy of the fact that they had to leave in the first place. So I've kind of been in both directions, Oklahoma and Georgia, in my professional life as well. So let's look at the Cherokees in particular. The Cherokees of Georgia were perhaps the most assimilated, the ones who have most adopted the white man's ways. Looking at the picture here, that's traditional dress. That's not how the Cherokee were dressed. They were dressed in suits, ties, bow ties, white man hairstyles. They weren't walking around with headdresses or face paint. So that picture right there is kind of even the wrong image to give off, because they were very assimilated into the white man's culture. But Georgia had a big motivation to want to displace them. It's because in 1828, gold was found on Cherokee lands in North Georgia. This kind of predates the gold rush of 1849. I always find it ironic. 1849, the rush to California gives us the San Francisco 49ers football team. What if the Georgia football team, Atlanta, what if the Atlanta Falcons were called the 28ers? Wouldn't quite hit the same, would it? The 28ers. We don't really think of the gold rush of 1828, but the gold was found on Cherokee land in Georgia in 1828. Well, what do the Cherokees have to say about this? This is Chief John Ross, chief of the Cherokee, and like I was just saying, see how he's dressed, see his hairstyle. He's very assimilated into the white man's culture with his dress, his speech, like he speaks English. He adopted Christianity, all that kind of stuff. The Cherokees, being the most civilized of the tribe, they were actually a separate nation recognized by a previous treaty. They already had an understanding with the American government. We are a separate nation, and Georgia has recognized our sovereignty. They also had an understanding of American law, and they understood that they could take this law, they could challenge this law in court. And they did. They challenged the law. They took their case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So they're using the white man's government against him, right? They're using the white man's government to take their case all the way to the Supreme Court. And the case is called Worcester versus Georgia, named after this missionary, Samuel Worcester. Basically, the Supreme Court, in the case, the Supreme Court rules that the Cherokee were already a sovereign nation, and only the federal government, not Georgia, had the power to form a treaty with another nation. Georgia can't kick the Cherokee off their land. They already had an understanding through a previous treaty, and the federal government could not. The federal government had to honor that. Well, both Jackson and Georgia ignores that ruling. Jackson ignores the fact that a previous treaty gave them sovereignty. Georgia ignores the fact that a sovereign nation can only have a treaty with the United States. Georgia's going to kick them off the land. Jackson's going to support it. Here's what the president says. This is a violation of the separation of powers, right? We believe that the executive is checked by the judicial branch. The legislative checks every branch checks each other. Power is a check to power. Jackson says this to violate that whole idea. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has made its decision. Now, good luck enforcing it. I'm the president. I'm going to do what I want anyway. Violating the law, but example of how he strengthened the power of the presidency by doing what he wanted. Not exactly the best part of his legacy, but it happened. What happens now is called the Treaty of New Echota. In 1835, these Cherokee are amongst the last to be, they're dragging their feet. They're not following the Indian Removal Act. They are staying at their homes. Well, a small group of Cherokee citizens, not their elected leaders, small group of Cherokee citizens sign a treaty giving their land to the federal government, and the U.S. government counted this as the agreement of the entire tribe. It would be like, just make an example as simple as I can. It would be like if my fourth block said, hey, yeah, we want to take the test on a day early. We're going to let first block do that. So if my fourth block said first block is going to take the test a day early, first block, how would you respond to that? You'd be like, they don't represent us. I'm not ready to take the test a day early. But I said, well, but they made the treaty with me. You got to take the test a day early. You'd say, but that was fourth block, not us. That's what this situation is. A group of Cherokee citizens, but they were not the elected leaders. Well, they scratched their name to this paper, and bada bing, bada boom. Andrew Jackson technically thinks he has the right to remove them from their land at this point. This is a marker, a historical marker. I'll let you read that on your own. So here's what's next for your notes. What is the Trail of Tears? Trail of Tears is the forced removal of Native Americans from Georgia to Indian Territory. And this is one of the saddest pictures that I think I show all semester. In 1838, behind the bayonet of the U.S. Army. Not my proudest moment for my organization. I'm in the United States Army. I wear that blue jacket. It does not make me proud that the U.S. Army removed the Cherokee from their homelands. The U.S. Army removed about 16,000 Cherokees who were moved first into holding camps, and then they were forced west to the Indian Territory. The leader of them, his name is General Winfield Scott. And we're going to hear about him again when the Civil War starts. He's been in the Army for a long time. He's going to stay in the Army all the way until the Civil War. So we're going to hear about him again. Not the best day in the history of the U.S. Army. Actually, one of the saddest days because of the way that the Army was used. Trail of Tears is commonly what's referred to as the 800-mile walk into Indian Territory. During this walk, the Indians were on foot. They were accompanied by soldiers who were forcing them along. If you look at a couple of these pictures here, the soldiers are on horseback. So the soldiers are getting a ride, but the Indians are being forced to walk. Old, young, they were bringing some of their stuff with them. They had some wagons, but not many. Because of the conditions, because it was across the winter, starvation, disease, harsh weather conditions, about 25% of them died along the way. So out of 16, that's 4,000 people who died along the way. And most of the deaths were their elderly, old people, and the young who couldn't handle the conditions of the march. Very tragic event. A couple of pictures here for you to look at. And obviously no photography, but you can still see the situation from some of the artist renderings here. It's called the Trail of Tears because anytime someone would die, they would just bury them right alongside the trail. Didn't have time to do all the proper mourning, have a funeral, have a service. You know, the Indians had spiritual rituals that they would have wanted to follow according to their religions. Didn't have time for that. Just had to put them in the ground. So you see to the left-hand side of that picture there, someone's being buried in the ground just right where they fell. If you fell off pace, if you were going slow and you fell behind, you might never catch up. You might just die in place and nobody would ever be there to care for you. And in the foreground, we can see an elderly woman crying. It is the Trail of Tears. Another picture for you to look at. This is an actual remnant of the Trail of Tears. You know, there was no Motel 6 on the side of the road. They didn't leave the lights on for you. Whenever darkness fell, you just stopped where you were and you slept right there, no matter the harshness of the conditions. So this is a portion of the trail still preserved where these Native Americans walked in order to get to Oklahoma. Known as the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee arrived in their new home, quotation marks home, without much of their past, that's the elderly, and without much of their future, that's the babies. You know, the younger generation, the teenagers and 20-somethings, they survived, but they didn't have the wisdom of the elderly, and they didn't have the future of the babies as well. I'll give you a chance. You can look at these historical markers on the PowerPoint that you're viewing in addition to this audio guide. Take a look at this map here. I do want to point out that the Trail of Tears was not a single trail. Okay, it wasn't like some super highway and all 16,000 walked exactly on this trail. It was multiple routes that all led to Oklahoma, and you can even see that some of these tribes didn't resist. The Cherokee resisted the longest. So the Seminoles, they got moving in 1832. The Creek, the Chickasaw, they got moving in 1832. The Choctaw in Mississippi, they got moving in 1830. It was the Cherokee who resisted the longest, holding out all the way until the last remnants, 1838. And then you see the various paths that lead into Oklahoma, present-day Oklahoma, what was then the Indian territories. Almost done here. Hang with me to the end. So what is the legacy of the Trail of Tears? Well, many people knew that it was wrong and stood up for the natives. Davy Crockett in Congress. You may know him as Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Davy Crockett, most famous for his fighting at the Alamo, being a frontiersman. He was actually a congressman from Tennessee at the time. He'd known Andrew Jackson for a long time. He fought with Andrew Jackson in some of those early Indian wars. Davy Crockett stood up in Congress and said, "This is wrong. We cannot remove these people from their homelands." He actually quit Congress right there. He decided, "I'm not running for re-election." He said, "I'm going to Texas." And that's what takes him to Texas to fight at the Alamo. So Davy Crockett, an advocate for the natives, he said this is wrong. Ralph Waldo Emerson, his picture on the right-hand side, he was a writer, famous writer. He took up for the natives. And John Quincy Adams, the former president, speaks out against this policy. That would be like, I'm just going to make a modern comparison. That would be like President Trump speaking out against President Biden's policies, or President Obama speaking out against President Trump's current policies. Sometimes the former presidents stay quiet. Sometimes, in this case, he felt it a moral imperative. I have to speak out. So he spoke out against his former opponent, said this is wrong. And a lot of people agreed with him. The real legacy is this. We can't just look aside and ignore the Trail of Tears as something that was part of a mid-19th century mindset. Oh, that was in the 1800s. That would never happen today. It could happen today. It happens when a group that has access to power gains and a group that is denied power loses. And in this case, loses their homes, and many of them lost their lives. This could happen today. This is why we study history, so we can see where we've been, so we can understand where we've been and see where we're going. Winston Churchill, quote I used on the first day of class, "A nation that does not study its past has no future." This is why we study our past, so we can see where we're going in the future. And you know the old line, "Don't make me repeat myself." History, right? Those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. Remember the Trail of Tears and avoid repeating these same mistakes in the future. Let me say that again. Remember the Trail of Tears and avoid repeating these mistakes in the future. Let me take it into the next presidency. Just one more step. I know we're in the age of Jackson, but following Jackson, President Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, in his message to Congress in December of 1838, okay, Jackson has just left office. Van Buren is in office. Van Buren says this. He tells Congress that the Cherokee, look at what I've underlined, immigrated without any apparent reluctance. That's a lie. That's a lie that he told to Congress. But if you didn't know otherwise, if you weren't there as an eyewitness, if you didn't have historical documents to analyze, you're going to take the word from your president, and your president tells a bold-faced lie saying that the Cherokee immigrated without any apparent resistance, as if they wanted to leave their homes and go to a new territory. Bold-faced lie. Sad portion of U.S. history. So the last part on your notes here, this is a big question, is what do you think? Let's put Andrew Jackson on trial. This is the trial of Andrew Jackson. Here's the question. Is Andrew Jackson responsible for the deaths of 4,000 Cherokee people? Did he put a gun to their heads and pull the trigger? No. Is he the leader of our country who ordered it to happen? The question for you is Andrew Jackson responsible for the deaths of 4,000 Cherokee people? I'll look forward to your responses in your toolbox. For now, you have whatever amount of time you have left in class. You have plenty to do, plenty of time to do it. Mr. Swanson, from this audio guide for Andrew Jackson, day 1. Tune in for day 2. Signing off.